stroking her hands. Those of you who were with Pat in the end and have been with others know what that's like. It's very hard to watch people that you love dying inch by inch by inch. I wanted to take her to a play last night in my home congregation at the UU congregation in Monmouth County because they were doing a performance of Amal and the Night Visitors. And I thought, she loves music. This would really lift her up. But she was so weak I couldn't even carry her out of bed. And so I didn't go. I stayed with her instead. When I say that this is a challenging season of the year, it is. And not just because death is always around us, but because so much in life is around us. And I think on that a lot as Christmas and Hanukkah appear, and we are called to celebrate our lives. Our service today is called Light One Candle. You can start. Have you started already?
Yeah.
I'm already on film. Cut that part. Hanukkah, as I said at the beginning, is not a holy event. It is a holiday event. And of course the word holiday comes from holy days, but in this case it is a joyful celebration. It's tied to the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, and most of you already know this story. I told it last year at the same time when I preached about miracles. In olden days, people did not light candles. They did not have candles. They used oil lamps. And they wound rags around various things they could set on fire with burning oil to make torches. And they carried the torches into their homes, or they set very small oil lamps about this size around in places where they needed light. Oil must have been a very precious commodity because light is so precious. And there, of course, was no electric illumination anywhere back in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and even well before then. Hanukkah itself is a word that means dedication. It's not a word that means the Festival of Lights, although it is the name for this period, the Festival of Lights. It refers to the fact that Judas Maccabee was able to recapture and restore the temple. He was a Kohen. A Kohen, K-O-H-E-N, was the traditional word for priest in Hebrew. His family was directly descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses. And as you may know, in the early days of the establishment of Judaism as an organized religion, people had jobs that were tied to their names. Their names reflected the jobs. This is true in India in the caste system. It was a caste system in Israel as well. So you couldn't be a priest if you were not descended from the line of the Kohens. Judas Maccabee, does anyone know what the word Maccabee means, Maccabeus? His nickname was the Hammer. He was a very bold soldier, and he led an uprising against the Seleucids who had taken over the rule of Jerusalem. Now, of course, leading an uprising in Israel has always been a dangerous, dangerous proposition, and it still is today. There is plenty of fighting still going on. I have, in fact, this is just an aside, and as I think of it, I have one Palestinian student at Brookdale Community College. The first writing assignment I gave my students was to describe a significant person or event that became a turning point in their lives. He wrote the story of his house being destroyed by an Israeli tank firing rockets at it. He was in the house with his family. He was 12 years old, and he described hearing just an enormous boom in the house, waking up screaming, hearing everyone in his house screaming, and the booming just went on until the house was absolutely flattened. His family ran out of the house, and they went to a grandfather's house. They hid there for quite some time, and eventually they moved to Jordan. It turned out that the Israelis that night had just decided they were going to go on a rather ad hoc rocketing experience. Their house wasn't chosen because they had done anything. It was just chosen at random. And it changed his life completely. The interesting thing is that he has said that if he had not gone through that experience, he never would have come to the United States. He never would have become the student that he is. And he never would have learned to love other people in spite of the badness around him and in spite of the experience of having his home destroyed. I find it very interesting to think about his life experience. He's all of 20 years old, and he's already been a displaced person, living in a camp, living in, other shelters, immigrating to the United States, learning to speak English, and he's turning into the top student in that class. When he first came in, I didn't think he had a snowflake's chance in hell of passing the course. I really didn't. His writing was awful. But he has thrown himself into it. He hasn't discussed religion with me, so I'm not sure what he's practicing now, if anything, but he's clearly a very spiritual person. Now, Hannukah is tied to the fact that when Judas Maccabee led his army and overthrew the Seleucid conquerors and occupiers of Jerusalem, they went into the temple. The temple was lit with oil lamps, and oil lamps are still used in many, many homes in the Middle East. I've seen this myself when I lived in Afghanistan. There was supposedly only enough oil to burn a lamp for one day. According to the story of the miracle that has become the legend, the oil lasted for 8 days. Now, as with many stories of miracles, we don't know if there's truth in this. We know that there's spiritual and emotional truth in it. We don't know if there's physical truth in it. But that almost doesn't matter when you're talking about a miracle. A miracle is something that requires a certain amount of faith in something that you have been told. In our tradition, we talk about founding father myths. And John Murray is one of those people who has a founding father myth about him, and some of you know that story well. Judas Maccabee also has a founding father myth around him. He was revered as the savior of the temple. And when the temple was rededicated and that oil was lit, every day it just kept going and going and going, and it lasted for 8 days. Now, if you look at the front table here, the altar, so-called, you will see that there are 2 different menorahs on there. Menorah is a word for a candelabra. In the usual Jewish temple, the candelabra has 6 small candles next to a shamash, the helper candle in the center. I can't I can't put up 6 fingers on my thumb. That would be the one over here in the wood. You see that? You probably may never have realized that there are 2 different kinds of menorahs. This one has the 6 with the helper candle in the middle, which is called the shamash, and the smaller one, which doesn't have any Hannukah candles in it yet, has 8. It has 8 plus 9. That's because the 8 represents the experience of the rededication and the miracle of the oil. They probably were not using candelabras in those days, unless they were using burning torches, because they didn't make wax the way we do. Now, the story here for lighting it, do you know how you light it? There's a sequence to this. You're nodding your head. Do you know?
Yeah. You start with the right. Start on the right.
You start on the right as though you were reading Hebrew. So you light the candles in the sequence that Hebrew is read. So you start with the candle all the way to the right, but actually you start with the shamash, that is the helper candle. This one. If you are, being careful and doing things according to custom, this candle should be higher than all the other candles or lower than all the other candles, because it is not the same as the candles for each day. So this candle would be lit first and used then to light the next candle. I'm going to be bold and light a candle. Hanukkah this year begins at sundown on December 16th, which is coming up in a couple of days. And it continues until Christmas Eve this year. And every year it shifts because unlike Christmas, which is tied to a solar candle, Hanukkah and all other Jewish events are tied to lunar candles, and so the time of it moves back and forth. Typically, a candle is lit every day for the 8 days until all of them have been out. And last year I think I told you the math of how many candles it took to keep the 8 candles going for Hanukkah. I've forgotten the number. So this would be the ordinary menorah. And this would be the Hanukkah menorah, which is called a Hannukah, which means it's the menorah for Hanukkah. It's the dedication, rededication, lighting arrangement. What happens at Hanukkah? Do you know? Has anyone ever celebrated Hanukkah? It's a family gathering, a time of lots of fun for children. It is a children's event in most Jewish families, rather than a temple-going event. You will see, if you looked carefully, that there's a Christmas tree behind me. And you may notice that it has some unusual ornaments on it. Can you see it? Thank you. Those are called dreidel lights. I bought them for my daughter when she was about 5 because her best friends in school were Jewish and her kindergarten teacher was Jewish, and my daughter was very interested in all things Jewish. So she said, can we get a dreidel and spin the dreidel? And I said, yeah, and I'll see if I can find you some dreidel lights. So there they are. And they're on the tree. And Barb said something which I thought was very appropriate. It's not a Christmas tree with dreidel lights. It's a Hanukkah bush. You know how bushes are important in the Jewish tradition, as with the story of the burning bush and Moses' experience with these things. So the dreidel lights. Do you know what's on the dreidels? There's a letter on each side of the dreidel, and you spin the dreidel when you're playing it as a game with children like a top. It's a spinning top. And the letters represent the first letters of a saying that runs something to the effect of, a great thing has happened, which means the oil survived in the temple. And you notice, if you've studied anything about traditional Judaism, that there are many acronyms in this religious tradition. Vowels are typically not present in the spelling, it's just the consonants, and so things are filled in terms of the sounds and the words themselves. The story, for instance, of Judas Maccabee and the Maccabean uprising is not in what's called the Tanakh. The Tanakh is the traditional name for the Jewish Bible. It is the canon, just like there's a canon in the Christian Bible. The canon of the Jewish Bible contains the writings of the Torah, which are attributed to Moses, although, of course, they couldn't possibly have been written by Moses, the teachings of the prophets, and the teachings of the writings. So there are 3 different sections. The T, the N, and the K are the letters that are most prominent in the word Tanakh. The T referring to the Torah, the N referring to the Nevi'im, which are the prophets, the K referring to the Ketubah. Those are the laws that come into it. So that is the name for the Jewish Bible. We don't often hear that word used, but that's exactly what it is. That story did not appear in there. That story did not appear until many centuries later when the Talmud was put together. The Talmud being the writings about the history and the laws of Judaism. The Talmud being something that Orthodox Jews in particular study endlessly, going over the Mishnah and the others, all the little itty-bitty things that become part of doctrine or orthodoxy in a religious tradition. And so the story of Judah Maccabee appears in the Apocrypha, the other books that were not officially put into the Hebrew Bible. Almost like, this is going wildly astray, but the Gnostic Gospels do not appear in the canon of the accepted Christian Bible. They are considered Apocrypha, other stories that were not approved by whoever was in charge of the decision. So that being so, another explanation for why Hanukkah is not considered a holy event. A happy event, yes, a wonderful time for children. And it involves gift giving, just the way Christmas does. It's also noteworthy that Hanukkah is something that really was not a widely celebrated event until about, I'm doing math, we're in 2015, about 50 years ago. That's when Hanukkah in this country took on a lot of social relevance. And some people think that that's not because of a religious thing, but because Jews in this country are so incredibly outnumbered by Christians and nowadays by Muslims and others that there was a feeling in Jewish families that children needed something. They needed something in the same season. And the story of Judas Maccabee was the perfect story. It's a story of a hero, Judah the Hammer. How can you not get excited? You have your own hero who had a hammer. Sort of like Thor with his hammer. And so Hanukkah came into being and it has become widely celebrated. Gifts are given and gelt is passed around. What is gelt? Yeah, money. What kind of money? Everybody knows that because we all know money, right? What kind of money is it? Yeah, but it's chocolate coins wrapped in gold foil, correct? Has anyone ever been given any?
Yes.
Yeah. The first time I went to a Hanukkah celebration, it was the first night of Hanukkah, and it was also Christmas Eve. So there was a tree. There was a tree for the Christian members of the family, gelt on the table for all the Jewish members of the family, dreidel lights everywhere, tinsel everywhere. And it was really a fabulous experience of realizing that Christianity comes right out of Judaism, that these are entwined faiths, and we often forget this. And it has been convenient historically for Christians to forget this when they were running away from the Jewish faith that spawned Christianity. That is, I think, one of the great sadnesses of Christian history, that Christians threw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. They ran away from their ancestral home in Judaism. The teachings of Judaism permeate Christianity, and we know this when we look at these values that are up here on the wall. Most of these are social justice values that come out of Jewish behaviors. But there you are. In order to establish a different kind of faith, Jesus the Jew, with all of his Jewish family, his Jewish followers, his Jewish neighbors, everyone in his world was a Jew of one sort or another. Jesus was singled out and lifted up and became the focal point of something very, very different from what Jesus was all about. And as Christianity spread, into the north, with it came all kinds of persecution of Jews. This is going on again in New York City right now, and it seems to every holiday season when temples and synagogues become the targets of graffiti and the burnings of things and stealing of religious artifacts from their temples. It's a very, very sad story. And I think to myself, in this time when Hanukkah is coming and dedication is focused on, the dedication to one spiritual tradition, it's important to remember that many of our gifts are the gifts not of the Magi, but they're the gifts of Jews to the world. If you've never celebrated Hanukkah, I hope you will think about it this year when it begins. I hope you will light a candle. I have a menorah in my house, and I light it every year during Hanukkah. My daughter doesn't know that I swiped her dreidel lights and brought them with me today. It is a time of celebration. It is a time of great happiness. It is a reminder of a triumph over oppression. And I can't help but think about that too when Jim put the pebble in recognition of the fear in this country that black people have, the real fear that they have, that they are going to be the targets of violence. There's no way around that. They are going to be the targets of violence. People are very afraid of each other for all those things that they see and not for the things they know. And as the aunt of 2 African American children, you know, I have heard all those stories. Last week I was preaching in Freeport, and I was at a table with, I think, 3 or 4 European Americans and 2 African Americans, and we were talking about our stories of what it's like to go out in the streets when you are the minority, and to think about what happens when you're followed and shadowed and suspected. And one of the most interesting stories was one told by a woman who said that whenever she goes shopping, when she gets to the cash register, the cashiers staple her bags closed with the receipts inside. And I thought, boy, I haven't heard of that in years. But she still encounters that. The suspicion that she is a thief because she's an African American in a store. And that's just a mild example, but a great insult to someone's humanity. I don't know if she's going to celebrate Hanukkah, but I hope so. I hope so. This country is in a lot of trouble. It's always been in a lot of trouble. It has some wonderful aspects to it, and it has some very difficult ones. And the fear that we have of otherness continues. It has not faded. It's still with us, isn't it? You've seen it? Have you watched the protests on television?
Yes.
Seen the marchers, the die-ins? A die-in, what a term to come up with, to complain about overreaching behavior. We all need to be more open to one another, kinder to one another, gentler with each other, less judgmental of one another just because we look different from one another. You looked around the room this morning, didn't you? And you saw each other. Yeah? When we leave this place, we need to look at each other as closely as we do when we're in this place. I'm going to wish you a happy Hanukkah and a Merry Christmas and a joyful Kwanzaa, and Bodhi Day has come and gone, a blessed Bodhi Day, and Saturday. Saturday was St. Lucia's Day, Santa Lucia, who is a Sicilian figure in history, but revered in Scandinavia, where I grew up watching parties with girls coming in dressed in white nightgowns and burning candles in their hair. You know, another expression of allowing light into the room, the external representation of the light, as opposed to the internal representation of the light. This is the time of year, I said before, the season of giving, the season of light, the season of darkness, the season of joy, and the season of sadness. My wish for you is that you let your inner lights shine, that you become a dreidel. A dreidel. You know, a great thing has happened. A great thing has happened in your being born and being here. That is a miracle. I hope you treat each other as miracles. Amen.